Hello there. This is going to be a fairly long piece, and subsequently for the security services, the Attorney General's only, unless you're a real die-hard fan. It may go on a little bit too long for you. The reason why it's quite long and quite technical is I have to answer a letter from the Australian government solicitors who are working for the various government witnesses that I've called by subpoena. And they've sent me a letter and they've said, can you explain why you want some of the people you subpoenaed? Now, these are all people that I never got to on the subpoena advent calendar. So to the Australian government solicitors' credit, those who I gave a bit of a thumbnail sketch about why I wanted them, they haven't asked as to why they've been subpoenaed. So good on you for that. And again, I've got no problems with the solicitors from the Australian government solicitor. You've obviously got instructions from the various people to say, can you get him to explain why I should have to go along and give evidence. I'm a very important person and I've got nothing to do with the affair. Fair enough, that's your instructions and you've put them to me. For those of you who are not lawyers, instructions means lawyers can only do what they're told to do, generally. And if a client wants to hang themselves, that's the client's own problem. Now, before I go into the various different people who seem to think they're a bit affronted that they might have to give evidence in my case, I will go and talk in terms of the sports rorts. And this might bring it home to those people as to why they've been called. I saw something in the Australian newspaper today, an article by Peter Van Onselen, and it was a very good article about the sports rorts. Now, this is the News Corp sort of flagship, and he has been pretty tough with them and said, well, some people wouldn't say too tough. He's laid it out and said it's pretty bad. In fact, I'm going to read you some of the quotes because why he says it's bad is important. The Auditor General found pork barrelling. Okay. And he quite rightly says that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the government were like, oh my God, no, it's not. No, it's not pork barrelling. Not us. Or there's nothing wrong with it. And that was the disgust. Well, most people think that's disgusting, but the interesting thing is the disconnect between what the government thinks is disgusting and what the people of Australia think is disgusting. The interesting thing about the sports rorts and why I bring it up is because those in the Canberra bubble don't think there's a problem. I think it summed it up that Bridget McKenzie was like, how dare you? Of course it's not a big deal. Everybody cheats. Everybody lies. You know, there's no such integrity, as if we have integrity as politicians. That seems to be her attitude. And at least she's being honest, I guess, because that is the attitude in the Canberra bubble. And so the reason I introduce it like this, and again, it's not just, a News Corp. If you read the Fairfax equivalent today in the Canberra Times, there's another good article saying people have had enough, we need an ICAC, a federal ICAC with teeth. I'm just going to change hands. I don't have a tripod, I don't like them. So it's both the big newspapers, both Fairfax and both, or whatever they're called now, Channel 9 and News Corp. The people of Australia have had enough of politicians who think taxpayer money, your money, the person down the street's money, is the government's money to spend on getting re-elected. It's okay if they spend money on defending Australia. It's okay if they spend money giving to deserving sports clubs, but it's not okay for them to give money in marginal seats to clubs that may swing the vote in order for them to get elected. It doesn't matter whether the clubs were deserving. You can't use our money, the public's money, as your election slush fund, as if it was a donation to give out to get re-elected. And the fact that you don't think there's a problem says everything about what's wrong with Australia. The fact that Morrison didn't sack Mackenzie and say, oh, this is really bad, straight off the bat, and the fact they tried to fight it shows you how bad Australia is. Okay, enough introduction. So here's my letter from the Australian government solicitors. And the following people are very affronted that they might have to give evidence in my trial. Mr. Dennis Richardson, former Secretary of Defence. Now, why would I want to see you, Dennis? Now, you were the Secretary of Defence from 2012 to 2017. You were also the Director General of ASIO and the Ambassador to the United States. So I think it's fair to say people in government like you. They think you're great. You're a safe pair of hands. Now, my defence is that the government is corrupt and that in the Department of Defence, money was fraudulently misappropriated for electoral purposes to get Stephen Smith elected in 2013, or to try, and that money should have been spent on protecting Australia. Now, I'll spell it out for you, Dennis. I think you allowed money to be spent on election purposes. You are like the sort of flunkies that allowed Bridget Mackenzie, probably on the orders of Scott Morrison, to spend money purely to try to win the election in marginal seats, knowing that it was wrong. Now, I don't care whether you don't think that it's wrong and that everybody does it. That's probably what you're likely to say. I've been in government forever, and that's what we do. I don't think the Australian people agree. I think money in the Department of Defence is meant for one thing and one thing only, to protect Australia. Now, you may say, I was ordered to do it by Stephen Smith. Fine, come in and say that. You may say, like Mike Pizzullo seems to think, oh, well, the secretaries should not second guess the minister. That's fine, come in and say it. If you've got something like this, bring in a legal advice that you got, which says it's not the secretary's role to second guess the minister. That's fine, bring it in. Happy to see that. If you have any examples, please come in and tell me when you said no, minister, when the minister had a plan which was clearly some sort of pork barrelling, sketchy use of defence money, and you said, no, minister, we can't do that. Maybe bring in about 5 examples of that. I'd like you to tell me the definition of what you think is illegal. Yeah, that's no trick question. What do you think is illegal? And then we'll go through whether you ever saw any examples of that in your tenure as Secretary of Defence. And please feel free to draw on your ASIO experience. I'm going to ask you whether you think there's any differences with being the Director General of ASIO and the Secretary of Defence. Again, I'd like you to tell me whether as Director General of ASIO you had any ideas about what was illegal conduct by the government and whether you had somebody who told you, yeah, no, we can't do that. And whether you had the same sort of ideas when you came to the Department of Defence. So that's about it. That should give you something to go on. If you want to try and set aside the subpoena, be my guest. I'm surprised that you think that the Secretary of Defence doesn't need to come in, even though the Chief of the Defence Force needs to come in and the Minister. Now, you all may have different stories. That's fine. Feel free to throw someone else under the bus. But yeah, turn up on the 2nd of March. Okay, who's next? General David Morrison. Luckily, I'm a bit spent out now. General David Morrison, you don't seem to think that you have anything to do with corruption in defence in the years 2013 to 2015. I almost just want to laugh about that. You were the chief of the army, and you did a number of highly questionable things, in my opinion, allegedly, as I have to say, to quote you. In fact, how about this? The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. Yep, I've always wanted to say that to you. And you walked past quite a few things. You walked past a very, very questionable press conference that you gave to a live audience where you grossly exaggerated something that had happened in defence, and you committed an illegal act in that you prejudiced the pending trials of people who should have actually had a fair trial, whatever they'd done. And you, by giving a press conference before the investigations had even finished, you actually made sure that they could never get us a fair trial. And it's a completely fundamental principle of our legal system that you don't do that. Now, you must have got legal advice on this, and that brings me to the next person I'm going to talk about. But I want to ask you whether you knew what you were doing was wrong. You also ruined the lives of a few people unnecessarily, and I think you knew you were doing that. I think you were talking it up, the Jedi Council scandal, so you could look good, and you needed some people to look really bad. Prejudicing the trials was completely out of order. That's why the police don't hold press conferences before we've had a trial. They're not allowed to. It would mean that the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, would go free. And that is something we don't do. And if you really hated the Jedi Council people, and that wasn't what they called themselves anyway, but if you really hated them as much as you said you did, you never would have done that, because you actually gave them a free pass in that they could have said, we can't be put on trial now. But of course, nothing was fair, and you totally changed the narrative, and so no one could really say, well, that's actually not what happened. It was highly illegal, and with the government bidding, you actually went to the United Nations and spoke on behalf of women's issues, knowing that you were not any great paragon of women's issues at all. You were an actor. The whole speech was a fraud in that the tape that was meant to be leaked was deliberately leaked, and that probably the security services were involved in that, and that you were never actually meant to be talking to the Australian Army. The whole thing was a front, a PR front, and yes, I may have some inside information about that. So I'm going to ask you about what I think is one of the greatest frauds ever perpetuated on the Australian people. But I'm glad you asked why you've been subpoenaed. And you asked, I've told you.